ahead and dive in. As I go through, feel free to throw any questions in the chat, or actually in the Q&A section is great for us so we can track them. Raj will answer some questions as we're going through, but we'll also leave time at the end for kind of general Q&A. So throw them in there and we'll do our best to get to them. And let us know what you think of all the new features as we're going through as well in the chat. So dive in. I'm going to assume that most people here are at least familiar with what Airflow is and have probably used it some before already. So I won't go through obviously too much of an intro here, but just want to set the stage for anybody who is newer or just anybody who's returning to Airflow usage or maybe doesn't use it every day or is curious kind of why this new release is a big deal. And so with Airflow being built on kind of code-based pipelines, these are the kind of main tenets that we see as really important to Airflow, and I bring them up because they're all really relevant to the 2.3 release. So obviously having this core built-in kind of Python-based code-based data pipelines, having a framework that's super extensible and really scalable, and 2.3 has features related to all of these things, and all of those were contributed by this really large, vibrant community. So Astronomer had a lot of folks contributing to this release. Lots of the community chipped in. Again, I'm going to go over all of this kind of in more detail, but I really think this was both building on and expanding upon kind of the main, core pieces of Airflow and really changing sort of what it can do. So, screen. So again, just for some history, kind of to set the stage for 2.3 today, Airflow has made really, really big strides in the last year and less than a year and a half. So it seems like a long time ago to me, probably to some of you that are using Airflow every day. But Airflow 2 was released just back in December of 2020, and that was obviously a huge game changer in terms of what Airflow could do. This major release that brought things like the HA scheduler and the task flow API. There's obviously a whole bunch of features that I could have listed here in addition to those. And the updates have come, pretty regularly since then, and they've all had really big kind of game-changing new features. Airflow 2.1, which was released mid last year, had things like DAG dependencies and the calendar view. Airflow 2.2 was a really big release last fall that had particularly deferrable operators and custom timetables. Those were both really big sort of new pieces of functionality to Airflow. If you're interested, we had a webinar on what was new in 2.2 at the time. So you can go back and watch that if you want to learn more about those features. And now we're already at 2.3. So, about maybe not even 6 months later. And really 2.3, I think, is the biggest, game-changing release since 2.0. Not that 2.1 and 2.2 had really great, really important features as well. But 2.3 in particular, this one feature that I'm sure you've heard about and that we're going to talk about in depth today with dynamic task mapping, really kind of changes in some ways the ways that DAGs are written or can be written within Airflow and sort of what you can do with Airflow. So huge progress that's coming to the Airflow project. And again, as a big thanks to the community that's contributing to it. So that's really exciting. So with that, again, there's a ton of new stuff in 2.3, so I'm going to jump right in. There are two major new features, or at least what I'm considering to be major new features that, again, I'm going to cover in depth today, and I'm going to go through a demo of how you can use those and implement them. There were also, I did a lot of counting in the PR list, and every time I counted a different number. So the list was long enough that it was difficult for me to count it, but at least more than 30 sort of more minor new features. So I'm going to touch on ones that I think are particularly important as well, or that you might want to be aware of, but there were more things than we can cover just in this webinar today. So that's kind of how big it was. We will also, don't worry, provide resources for you to find all of those new things, including if you want to go through all of the bug fixes and stuff that were included, as well as docs changes. We won't have time to cover things like that today, but there was lots of that as well. So those things are always really helpful and kind of in the great if you don't have to pay attention to them, but if you do, you really need them sort of category. So overall, there were over 200 merge PRs that went into this release. Again, it was 6 months of work from a really large number of people, lots of new code, lots of updated code, and we're really excited about the result of all of that. So I'm going to dive right into those two major new features that I mentioned. And the first one that, again, the entire community is super, super excited about. We've been waiting for this for a long time. And we're going to talk about it a lot today, is dynamic task mapping. So this is probably the biggest feature in Airflow 2.3. Again, you might argue with me depending on your particular use case, but it's certainly the biggest kind of game changer within Airflow that's coming with this release. And part of why we say that 2.3 is the biggest new release since 2.0. And so why we say that is because it really allows you to write DAGs in a totally different way than you could before. So what dynamic task mapping does is allows you to create DAGs that take a set of inputs at runtime and creates a task for each one. This is different from what you could do in Airflow before, where so you may be familiar that you could create some amount of dynamicness to your DAGs because they were written in Python code. So you can generate DAGs dynamically. Lots of people do that. You could generate tasks dynamically, but you can only do that at parse time. So when the scheduler actually parses the code in your DAG, you could have like a for loop or something in there that generated those tasks, but you couldn't have that actually change at runtime. And I'm going to go through sort of some of the benefits of what that shift means. But that's what dynamic task mapping is. So just to help put that in perspective, this is helpful for use cases like you might be running an ETL pipeline that processes files or tables or something like that. And you don't know ahead of time how many there are. You want a task for each one, but that number might change all the time. Or maybe you just don't know and you don't want to keep track of it. You might do something like run a particular task per customer when that list of customers changes frequently. This is something that Astronomer has heard from customers quite a lot, is they say we have DAGs that run, a machine learning model or an ETL job or something that just processes a file or publishes a web page or any of the above, but we need it to happen one task per customer, and that customer list will change. Hopefully it grows a lot, sometimes there's churn, things like that, and you need your DAGs to be able to react to that. Another really common application is all sorts of different ML ops type workflows that could benefit from this type of thing. Everything from hyperparameter tuning or training a different set of models for each input data set. Again, anything where you kind of don't know the number of or all of the different inputs to what you want your tasks to be based on, that's where dynamic task mapping is going to come in handy. So, and again, some of the benefits of this are that you're going to implement the task changes, or I should say, you'll implement tasks that change at runtime. And you can do this based on the state of previous tasks. So it might be a list that you know ahead of time, and that's fine. You can pass that in. But probably more commonly, or what's more beneficial, is being able to do that based on some upstream task. So either your upstream task, trains a bunch of different models, and you say everything with some, criteria for how successful it was gets passed on. They need a task for each of those. It might be, going to find files somewhere, a task for each file. That's what I'm going to show later. So anyways, that can come from, any of your upstream tasks in your DAGs, which is really huge. You couldn't do anything like that before. One of the benefits of implementing dynamic tasks in this way is that it maintains task atomicity. I always struggle with that word. So you can imagine that, again, because your DAGs are written in Python, you could, and some of you maybe have, written just a massive Python function that goes and does, finds whatever that list is, and then, loops through that list and does whatever work you need to do. But you had to implement it all in one task because Airflow couldn't handle that, which is okay. It's a way of working around that, but, it doesn't maintain that sort of best practice of keeping all of your tasks atomic, having them each do one particular thing. It makes it really hard to recover from failures. It makes it harder to debug. It's just not as, good for the user in that case. Kind of similar to that, dynamic task mapping will reduce top level code in your DAG file. So you don't have to be trying to implement, dynamic tasks at parse time, which means, every time the scheduler parses your DAG, which is super frequently, it's running through some list to try and figure out what your tasks need to be. Again, not great for performance. So no need to worry about that. None of this is going to be calculated until your tasks actually run. And one of the particularly important ones, in my opinion, is that by implementing dynamic tasks in this way, you'll maintain a history of those tasks, even when that input no longer exists. So this was another kind of pitfall of one of the workarounds that I've talked about for dynamic tasks. Is that, if you're implementing, some sort of list at parse time, and then the next time your list has gotten shorter, whatever was in there before is no longer going to show up in your DAG history. As far as Airflow is concerned, you have removed that task. And that can obviously be problematic. So here with dynamic task mapping, all of it is going to stay, and I'll show in just a few minutes how you actually go through the UI and get all of that information. And finally, it does help you avoid some of the pitfalls of dynamic DAGs at high scale. So implementing dynamic DAGs still useful in some cases, but if you were doing that to sort of get around this lack of dynamic task functionality, dynamic tasks are going to be much more performant in the sense that you're not going to have those sort of issues at really high scale that you get with dynamically generating your DAGs. So let's head and talk about how you actually implement dynamic tasks. So we're super excited about this feature. How do I actually use it? Fortunately, super simple. You basically have two new functions within Airflow that are going to help you implement this feature. And they're called partial and expand, and you are going to use at least the expand and maybe both of them to pass parameters into the operator that you want to map on. So the partial function is going to be for any parameters that you want to remain constant for all tasks. So I'll show more detailed examples of this, but you can imagine, you might only be mapping over one particular parameter within your operator, where you say, I want a copy, for each one. Everything else is going to stay the same. So those all get passed in with partial. Expand is what's going to actually do the mapping. So that's the parameter you want to map over. So in the code example below, I have a really simple Python task. It takes two inputs, X and Y. It returns the addition of those two. And then you can see here where I call this function now in my DAG. I have partial where Y equals 10. That means every single time I want Y equal to 10. I don't want it to change. And then I'm going to expand on X, and I'm going to pass a list. So 1, 2, and 3. So this is going to result in 3 parallel tasks, basically copies of this add task for each one of these X values. When I pass in a parameter that I'm going to map over, it has to be in either a list or a dictionary. But otherwise, whatever is in there can be whatever your function needs. So super straightforward there. And sorry, I keep clicking out of this. We're going to go into a demo where I'm going to show this kind of in a little more detail, and you can get a sense of how it works in just a second. But before I do that, I want to talk about the other of the two major new features, because it's going to be very relevant in a moment, and that's the new grid view. So this is a UI update to Airflow that's come in 2.3, and it's a pretty big one. So you're probably familiar with the tree view, which is what the grid view is going to replace. And the tree view was helpful, but it had a couple of problems in that people found it pretty confusing, because it was trying to sort of both show you a task history and the dependencies within your DAG at the same time, so hence the tree. And it just didn't work that well. People were unclear about why there were repeated tasks, how they showed up in that tree, and you sort of got kind of the worst of both worlds in a way. So the grid view is a vast improvement on that. So it's going to take away the tree part and just focus on the task history and give you a lot more granularity and control there. So you'll still have the, an overall view of your DAG dependencies and structure within the graph view. But the grid view is now devoted just to this sort of, again, task history and overview. So we're going to jump into a demo where I cover both of these things in depth, because again, the grid view is also super important for how you view your dynamic tasks. So with that, I'm going to hop over to Airflow here. So I have Airflow running on my local computer. I'm running our Astronomer version of Airflow 2.3, which again, we're already on post 2, so lots of great updates to keep up with there. If you're not familiar, you can use the Astronomer CLI to run Airflow locally on your own computer. It is open source, so it's available to everyone. It's a super easy way to get up and running and start playing around with 2.3. So that's what I've done here, and I have 2 DAGs that I want to go over. So the first one, I'm just going to show this simple mapping example, and I'm actually going to jump into the code first for this DAG. So you can see super short, not much going on here. This is really just to highlight how the mapping works. And so what I have here is a task that makes my list that I'm going to map over, and it's returning a list that is some random number of integers between 2 and 4. So so the list that I'm going to map over will change when I run this DAG. So sometimes I might have 2 tasks, sometimes I might have 3 tasks, I might have, I guess actually, 4 tasks in this case, just to give you a sense of how it changes. That list then gets passed to my downstream task, which is going to take it and get mapped accordingly. You can see actually doing that passing. So with decorated tasks like this, it's super straightforward. So I call this my consumer task, and I'm going to use that expand function. And then for the value, which is the parameter that I need to pass in, I actually just pass in the function call to my upstream task. So this is kind of using the task flow paradigm with decorated tasks. I'll show you in a minute with the other DAG how to do it with traditional operators. You can do that too. But it's easy to implement this way with those decorated tasks. So that's what that does. If we look at the graph view, you'll see I just have these 2 tasks. And for this consumer one, you'll notice that it's marked with the brackets and then a 2 in the middle. So this is how the graph view is going to indicate to you that this is a mapped task. It's not just a single one. And as you probably gathered, the number in the middle is the number of mapped instances that occurred for that DAG run. So if I were to click on this, you'll notice that I have 2 mapped instances. I can come in here and I can select which one I want. And then, access any logs, XCOMs, instance details, etc., as I would any other task. So, or I can also perform the actions on the entirety of the mapped task if I want to. So cool, pretty straightforward. Let's look at the grid view, and we'll sort of go through both the new grid view and the mapped task concept at the same time. So overview of the grid view, really quick. It's pretty intuitive. I highly recommend everybody, get started with Airflow 2.3 and just play around with it. I think it's really cool. It's really easy to understand. You're still going to have a list of your tasks here on the left. Again, any mapped tasks will be indicated with these brackets, which just tells you that there's more than one potentially in there. If I click on any one of these tasks for a DAG run, I'm going to see, a lot of the task actions that you've always had available, but they weren't always, they didn't always show up, or always, they didn't show up in the tree view because that's not how it was designed. So you have access to a little bit more stuff here. And in this particular case, this is just a single task. So you just see the information about that one here. If I instead click into my consumer task, which is the mapped one, you will see all of my mapped instances here. And you'll notice that for this particular one I've chosen, my random generator gave me 4 tasks. So I see all 4 of those here. Again, I have some quick links to logs and other things for the individual tasks themselves. I can also select multiple and act on all of them if I wanted to clear their statuses and rerun them or something like that. I can do so. So this is kind of the best way to see what's going on and interact with your tasks. But you can notice that if I go to, let's try this one. This time I only have 2 mapped instances. So in the case where this is my customer data. Right now I have 2 customers. Yesterday I had 4 customers. That's not great, but I still have a record of all of the actions that were taken, the tasks that were run when I had, all of those 4 customers. So super beneficial there. Really exciting. Other things I'll point out in the grid view, it does show you the duration of the DAG run. That's what these bars are. This is not the most interesting example since this one's just kind of running a quick Python function, though you do notice this one here took quite a bit longer, so who knows. But this can be really helpful if you actually have DAGs that are doing real work and might take a while to run. You can easily identify what's going on in them. So that was our simple example. Let's go into the more interesting kind of real world example. So I'm gonna look at this mapping ELT. And again, I'm going to hop to the code first. That's not true. We're gonna hop to the graph first so that I can give you a sense of what's going on. So this DAG is going to grab a set of files from S3 and load them to Snowflake and then process them within Snowflake. So pretty simple ELT kind of example. Where mapping comes in here is we're going to assume that I have no idea how many files are going to be in S3. And it could change every time the DAG is run, but I just know that they're going to be there and I want a task for each one to upload them to Snowflake. Again, a couple benefits for doing this way. If one of your uploads fails or something like that, you have an easy way of rerunning it without dealing with all those other files that were uploaded successfully. You don't want to duplicate things. Again, keep those tasks atomic as best practice because it's easier to recover from failures. It's easier to understand what's happening in your DAG and yeah, keep track of what's going on there. So what my tasks here are going to do is get those S3 files and load them into Snowflake. We'll look at the code for this in just a second. Then simultaneously, I'm going to run my transformation query, so the T in my ELT within Snowflake. And then I'm also going to do a little bit of cleanup within S3 so that I know, okay, these files have been processed. They're going to get moved to another folder. What that looks like in the code is pretty standard. So again, a couple different operators here. So first I have my task that's going to get my S3 files. Just using an S3 hook here, I'm getting a list of the current files in my bucket based on, yeah, my prefix, it's like that. And then you'll notice that I'm actually doing a little bit of kind of processing within this return here, and that I'm not, there is actually an operator that will return you a list of S3 keys in a particular bucket. But remember that for dynamic task mapping, I have to pass in a list of all of the items that I want to map over. And so you need to pay attention to Airflow doesn't care what's in that list. It's just going to take each entry in the list or in the dictionary, either one, and pass it into your operator. So you have to keep in mind, what does my operator actually need for the parameter that I'm mapping over? So we'll come back to that in just a second, but that's why I'm doing this here in a Python function. Then I define my DAG, and then this is the important one. So the S3 to Snowflake operator is what I'm actually mapping over. So again, I'm creating an individual parallel task copy of this S3 to Snowflake for each file that shows up in S3. For most of this, the stuff that needs to get passed as this operator, it's going to be the same all the time. So that's why I'm making use of this partial function. So my task ID, the S3, the Snowflake stage, the table I'm loading, my schema, the file format, Snowflake connection, all of that stuff is going to stay the same regardless. So I don't have to worry about passing that stuff in. Then in my expand, I'm going to pass in my S3 keys. And again, I'm just going to do that by calling the function that I define above, get S3 files. And you'll notice that it has this current prefix parameter that I've passed in with a date. That's to make the DAG idempotent. So it's going to look for only a folder with the name of the current date, or not the current date, the date that the DAG is running for. So we'll look for that in particular. Again, part of why I make this here a list of lists is because the S3 to Snowflake operator expects this S3 keys parameter to be a list. So it has to return, if you don't return a list, if you just return the string, it will throw you some weird error. So again, that's why I'm using this Python function to just get everything in the right format, but then I can just pass that in. The rest of this DAG is just standard, kind of your regular S3 copy object, delete object, the other Snowflake operator that runs the transformation query. Nothing different about these from your standard 2.3. So now let's go back to the grid view and look at this DAG. Actually, sorry. I'm going to, before I run this, pop over just so you can see what's going on in S3. So this is my bucket that I'm using. Notice I have the process folder where all of my process files go. And then I have this folder for today, May 3rd, 2022. It currently has 3 CSVs in it. So I'm going to run the DAG and I'm going to expect to get 3 individual tasks within my mapped task. And then I expect this will get moved into processed. So if I hop back here and go ahead and trigger this DAG, we will wait a second for it to run. Should take just a minute. You'll see the bar going up as the duration gets longer. This one you see more variation. I'm including the failures. Okay, and this one is done now. So let's look at the mapped task. Again, that has the brackets. And if we look down here, you do see I have 3 mapped instances. So 1 for each of those files. So super cool. I can, if one of these had failed, something wacky had happened with one of the files, it didn't get uploaded to Snowflake, I would know exactly which file. I wouldn't have to dig through the logs or anything like that. So really, really cool new feature there. Another thing I'll note, so if I hop back over to S3 and refresh this guy, you'll notice that folder is now gone. It's been moved into processed. If I come back and run this DAG again, it's no longer going to find any folder with today's date, which means it doesn't have any work to do. So the list that I'm returning to map on is empty. In that case, what will happen is your mapped task will be skipped. And any downstream tasks will be run according to whatever your trigger rules are. So in my case, my trigger rules are all of the default, which is all success. Because the task upstream of them was skipped, they are also skipped. You can change this behavior, obviously, by modifying your trigger rules, but that is what will happen if you pass in an empty list. So it is smart enough to handle those cases as well, where sometimes there might not be any work to do. That's totally fine. We still run the DAG. And we just handle that downstream accordingly. Cool. So again, super exciting new feature, really easy to implement. Highly recommend that everybody go kind of play around with it and get a feel for how you can implement this in your own use cases. We are already using it internally at Astronomer. Again, we're super excited about it. It really is pretty game changing in terms of what you can implement within your DAGs. It looks super simple because from a user perspective, it is, which is what we want. Took a lot of work to implement this within Airflow, but it really greatly expands, all of the use cases that you can implement. Things you can do dynamically, or use cases, I should say, that you can implement dynamically. Cool. So I'll go back to slides here for a few minutes. And I also want to talk about other new features in Airflow 2.3. So we promised you what's new in Airflow 2.3. Obviously, dynamic task mapping is the biggest, in my opinion, most exciting new feature that will have a huge impact for many users. However, there are lots of other new features as well. I want to touch on a few of those. So again, this is kind of my curated list of what I thought people should be aware of. It is, a bit opinionated in that sense, but we will provide links to, everything that was released in 2.3. But a couple of pretty notable updates to operators within 2.3. They added a branch Python operator decorator, which is really cool. So now that you can use, decorated tasks for all of your Python operators, if you were also branching within them before you had to just use a traditional operator, now there's a decorator. So again, even easier to implement branching. Somewhat, well, potentially related to branching, the short circuit operator got a bit of a makeover, which makes it kind of more usable now. So you can configure it to respect downstream trigger rules, which means if you're going to do things like short circuit a branch that then kind of comes back together, or other sort of use cases like that, you can do so. Before you couldn't. So short circuit was pretty limited in what you can do with it. Now it's not. So that's exciting. Dummy operator has been replaced with the empty operator. This is part of the ongoing effort to make sure that we're always using inclusive language. So that's really exciting. Empty operator does exactly the same thing, but if you do use the dummy operator in your DAGs, you may see a deprecation warning about that. So that's what that's about. You can switch it to empty. Python operator has a new show return value in logs parameter. This is again one that if it impacts you, it's a big deal. If it doesn't, it's probably not. But you can now toggle that on or off. So if your Python operator is going to return, sensitive information that you don't want printed explicitly in your logs, you can turn that off. Super convenient. And I think I would be remiss without adding that fun little Easter egg that was added last month. There is now a smooth operator, which does return you the link to the YouTube video of the song. So if you're looking to get that stuck in your head, if me just mentioning the song didn't already get it stuck in your head, you're welcome, and you can go do that today. So fun little addition there. There's also a couple of notable connection updates that just help continue to make the connection experience better within Airflow. We have removed the requirement that custom connection UI fields be prefixed. If you've ever tried to create a custom connection and then generate the URI for that with those prefixes, it's really annoying and just long and super messy. So this helps clean that up a lot. There's also a new feature to enable JSON serialization for connections. This means you can define your connections in JSON now, another option as opposed to, submitting via the URI or something like that. So another kind of convenience there. And a couple of other great additions kind of in random categories. So there's a new trigger rule called all skipped. Again, something that if you've never encountered a need for it, you might not. But if you do have a need for it, it's obviously important. So if you were trying to, implement custom logic to get at that trigger rule, you no longer have to. So that's nice. There is a new events custom timetable, so that's super exciting. Custom timetables were a great feature from Airflow 2.2, but they can be a bit challenging to update. So I think that we'll see, more and more of those contributed back to the community. The events one was one of those that now everybody can use. And then there's a new Db Downgrade Cli command, which I think is super exciting. So if you prior to this, you didn't really have a way of downgrading your DB. So most Airflow upgrades require schema changes to the Airflow metadata database. So if you were to upgrade, then you can't go back. The DB downgrade CLI command allows you to roll back that update and go back to the old schema version. So that can be super useful for testing new versions and things like that. There's also, again, another one that sounds really small, but could actually have been big impacts is there's a new DAG ID pattern parameter to the DAGs endpoint of the Airflow API. This allows you to do things like using the tilde for all DAGs or, matching DAGs to, again, some sort of pattern you have. So if you needed to say, pause everything that's running, or make a certain change to all DAGs that had, your team name prefixed on them or something like that, you can now do that easily with the API. Again, way too many updates that for me to cover them all here. So we didn't try to do that, but I did link out to the release notes. Definitely recommend going through them. There's lots of other kind of minor additions like this that might be will certainly be super helpful to some people, and that might be you. So take a look at those and all of the other release announcements that we're super excited about. And okay, so that was kind of a whirlwind tour of the new 2.3 releases. I want to leave lots of time for questions. So we won't go through anything else new today, but if you do want to learn more, again, stay tuned for a recap email that will have some of these additional resources along with the code that I went through today and these slides. And also, if you're looking to learn more about 2.3 releases, 2.3 release features. The Airflow Summit is coming up in, 2 weeks, something like that, 2 or 3 weeks. We're super excited about that. There are going to be talks related to new 2.3 releases. Wow, I really can't say that sentence. To new 2.3 features. I know Ash Berlin-Taylor, who's part of our team at Astronomer, is going to be giving a talk on dynamic task mapping. I'm super excited for that. And he was one of many great developers on that feature. So there's also going to be other talks related to 2.3, as well as lots of other things. So shameless self-plug, I will also be giving a talk actually in person at the Seattle area meetup. So for those of you that said in the chat earlier that you're calling in from Seattle, consider attending in person. That will be super fun. But we hope that everybody goes and registers because there's going to be tons of great Airflow content there, and I think you won't want to miss it. So with that, I will go ahead and open it up and answer any questions from today.
Awesome. Kenton, I think that was one of your best demos yet. So many folks in the chat were saying how helpful the demo was. So you really knocked that out of the park. Great job.
Great.
But with all good demos, it causes a ton of good questions. So I'm going to try to serve these to you as we go here.
Cool.
But you mentioned this, but it still came up a few times in the chat. Can I use the map features for all operators, or do I have to be using task flow or a certain subset of operators?
No, so you can use them on any operator. So that can be a traditional operator or a decorated task. So if you do it for a traditional operator, that's kind of like this one, like I do here on the S3 to Snowflake, where I'm using the expand here. So it doesn't matter what operator. The things to keep in mind there are if you are going to use I should say, the results of a traditional operator to map on, which I didn't show here, then you have to make sure that those are pushed to XCOM and you have to pull them from XCOM. Totally fine to do that. You just have to do it explicitly. But it's super easy, and there is an example of that in the Airflow documentation. The other thing to keep in mind there is that you can't map on every parameter. So you can't map on like a task ID or a pool or really most of the base operator parameters. So keep that in mind, but any operator, yes, you can map.
Awesome, awesome. And then expanding on that again, could you just go through the partial and expand parameters and how those work? Because I think that's really the meat of how to use the feature.
Yeah, totally. So partial is going to be anything that you want to stay the same across all of your mapped tasks. So you can think of when I have the operator as a normal single task and I'm going to map on it, I'm going to create a bunch of copies that vary based on some parameter that I've input. But a lot of the other parameters I want to remain the same. So those get passed in with partial. If you don't have anything you want to remain the same, you don't have to pass partial in. This is not a great example of that because you definitely have all these other parameters, but you don't have to use partial if you don't need it. So yeah, you just do dot partial and then whatever parameters are staying the same. And then when you do dot expand, that's going to be whatever parameters you want to map. So in this case, the parameter I'm mapping on is called S3 keys. That's unique to this S3 to Snowflake operator. And then whatever I pass to it has to be returned as either a list or a dictionary. In this case, my list is coming from another function within my upstream task, right? I'm generating it here. It could also be, zoom back to this slide. You could also predefine it, right? That's sort of not the super beneficial part of the feature, but just to highlight how it works here. It's just a list that I'm passing into that expand. Every entry in the list or dictionary that you pass is going to result in a task.
That's a great explanation. Thank you for that. There's a couple of questions around map tasks and what you can do with them. So we're going to go through those. Can the partial function also take templates, right? Like can you use Ginger templating and other sorts of things on the partial function?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, just like you normally would. So in this case, I actually only have the templated piece in my expand function call, but if you needed to template one of these, you still can. Yeah, just like you would normally.
Gotcha.
Well, I should caveat that with some parameters are not templatable in Airflow in general, and that will remain the same here. It's not different. So consult your operator on what's templatable. But yeah, if it normally is, then it is here too.
Gotcha. Perfect. And then do templated tasks behave like normal tasks? So can I do things like trigger rules and dependencies on them or other sorts of things?
So for mapped tasks in general, yes, you can. So sort of yes and no. Right now, so dynamic task mapping is built off of this concept of map reduce, which means you sort of map out your tasks and then you can reduce back to a single one. So you can have like downstream dependencies, right? So here's my mapped task. This is actually like 4 tasks in the example that I showed. And I have these things that are downstream of it. I can set the trigger rules for these tasks to be anything that I normally could. So if I say one of these mapped tasks fails, I need, these to behave accordingly. So you can definitely still do that. You can also, you can set the trigger rule of your mapped tasks. So trigger rule is not mappable. So that would have to all be the same, but you can change that just as you would any other task. You can also map based on the results of a mapped task. So there's an example of this in the Airflow docs, but you could have like a downstream task from this one that was also mapped based on some sort of result, right?
Perfect. That was the next question, is if you could use a map task for map tasks. So you got right, you got in front of that one.
Yeah.
What about the grid view? There's some folks that are like, hey, the grid view looks cool, but I'm not used to it yet, right? I remember the things on the tree view. Do you lose any information on the grid view that you didn't have on the tree view?
Yeah, so the only bit of information that you're losing here is the dependencies between your tasks. So that's what the tree showed, right? Where you had those things were actually organized like in a tree layout, which is what resulted in, if you had like branching within your DAG, you would have duplicates of, tasks. So that is gone. Generally, the order you see here from top to bottom is the order in which they run. And my colleague Brent, who designed this, told me somehow at some point how the order was determined, and now I can't remember. But you do have, so in this particular DAG, some of these tasks are actually parallel. So they're running without any dependencies. So you don't see that information here, but in general, top to bottom is approximately the order in which things run. Kind of what you gain from having lost that is a lot more sort of granular information about your actual task history, and it's a little easier to understand here. So if you're looking to view sort of what are the dependencies between tasks in my DAG, you should go to the graph view. If you're looking for any information about your task instances or what's happened in the history, you should come here.
Perfect. Super helpful. And to confirm, there's no option to turn tree view back on, right? We're just going to deprecate it for the dynamic tasks.
So not grid view is not specific to dynamic task mapping. It's just a new feature in 2.3. So I'm highlighting them together, but you'll see the grid view for every DAG. And no, I do not believe you can turn the tree view back on. I think it is gone as of 2.3, as far as I know.
Perfect. So another question here. I just had it written down. Sorry, give me 1 second. I keep all these notes as we go through here. Cool. What about the way XComs work with dynamically mapped tasks? Is the XCom API going to work similarly, or do I have to do something different for that?
Yeah, it is effectively the same. So again, you do need to keep in mind if you want to, I should say, probably the biggest thing to keep in mind is if you want to map on the results of a task in your DAG, and that task is using a traditional operator, again, those results will have to come from XCOM, and not all operators push results to XCOM, right? So that is something to keep in mind. But in terms of actually using XCOM within the tasks, yes, it's effectively the same. So any operators that are going to return something, or like in this case, I've defined it, task flow, it's a little easier, right? It's the same. So that's going to get stored in XCOM. I could manually push something to XCOM here. We will, as part of the, I don't have it pulled up right now, but the Airflow docs on dynamic task mapping are super helpful. They have a whole bunch of kind of scenarios with like little code snippets of how you do them. And they do show pulling a value from XCOM to, map on that value. So, but it's effectively the same. And same thing for your mapped tasks. So this particular operator, I don't think returns anything. So I don't think I'll see anything in XCOM. But if your operator does normally return something, or you've designed it to, each one of your mapped tasks will return whatever they're going to return in XCOM. And you'll see those under the different instances. So if I go back to this one, sorry, I can't remember which one of these is the XCOM button. It's this one. Yeah. So here there's no XCOM, but you can see I'm doing this for the particular instance that I mapped.
Perfect. And when I have a set of map tasks, can I assign priority to those as they're mapped out, or does Airflow treat them all the same?
So it will treat them all the same. So as far as I know, the only way that you could assign priority in that sense was to add tasks to a pool and weight them, and you can't map on a pool as of right now. So they're effectively just parallel.
Makes sense. Might be a cool feature request though for maybe 2.3.1 or something to be able to have that.
Yeah, for sure.
All right, we have time for one more question here. So the thing that you haven't answered yet is, other than the dynamically mapped tasks, what is your favorite new feature in 2.3?
Ooh, that's a good question. That's tough. I mean, probably the grid view, which I feel like is the boring answer because it was the other major feature that I presented. But I do think it's really cool and super helpful. And the more that I play with it, the more I like it compared to the tree view. Yeah. I also am super excited about the DAG pattern parameter option in the API though. Again, kind of a weird one. Like if you don't ever need that, then you might not care about it, but if you do need it, it's super, super helpful. So I find things like that pretty exciting.
Yeah, just want to point out that we made it through about 30 questions before I seemed to stump you on one. So that stump was, what is your favorite?
It's hard. There's too many options.
Cool. All right, everyone. I think we're just about at that time. So Kenton, thank you so much for going through that. That was incredible. Like we were saying, all of the code as well as the video and the recap will be sent over in your inbox pretty soon here. And yeah, be on the lookout for the next webinar topic. Happy Tuesday, everyone. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Hi, guys.